Hello and welcome to the Free Market Foundation, wherever you happen to be tuning in to this special live broadcast. My name is David Ansara, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you again in this, the second live stream in a series of media briefings that we're doing over the next few weeks regarding a very special policy program that the Free Market Foundation is putting forward for consideration by politicians, policymakers, civil society, and of course, you as an ordinary South African who happens to be concerned about the trajectory of our country. We've seen some pretty big political changes in 2024 and a new government that is now, I think it's fair to say, past the honeymoon period. But we haven't really seen substantive changes in policy. And that's what we at the Free Market Foundation want to change. We want to have conversations about the core drivers of economic freedom in South Africa. That is our lodestar. And a couple of weeks ago, we launched the Economic Freedom of the World Index in conjunction with our partners in the Fraser Institute in Canada. They rank countries around the world according to their levels of economic freedom. South Africa ranked 81st out of 165 countries. We want to see South Africa climbing up those rankings. Then last week, we launched the first in our series of 5 papers. That was with Dr. Morne Malan, and he authored our paper on international trade, the ability of a country to attract skills, capital, and talent, and to trade and interact in a global economic context. If you haven't already seen that live stream and our paper, do check the links in the description and go back through our channel. But today, we're talking about the size of government. That is the second key area out of 5. The others are private property rights and the judiciary, regulation, and then also sound money. But today we're talking about a very important topic of the size of government. I think, especially during this week, when we are seeing the medium-term budget policy statement being presented by the Minister of Finance, we need to have a serious conversation about balancing the budget, about the public sector wage bill, about the state of state-owned enterprises and their underperformance, and what is the profile of South Africa's fiscus. Our debt to GDP ratio is rising to about 75%. So these are really critical structural issues for South Africa. We've seen a lot of goodwill and positive sentiment towards the GNU. But these problems haven't gone away, and we need to start having a serious conversation about how to address these. So I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague at the Free Market Foundation, Dr. Martin van Staden. He is, I beg your pardon, not a doctor yet. He's submitting his PhD thesis, so we'll soon be able to call him doctor, but for now he's a mister. But we're confident that he'll get that PhD. But Martin is the author of today's special paper. And it is there for you to download. If you follow the link in the description, we'll also post a link in the comments section. Do go and look at that paper. It's very accessible, but also very deep in its analysis. I think that's enough from me. I want to hand over to Martin, and he's going to give us a short presentation. And then we'll have an opportunity to have interactive Q&A. I'll have some questions for Martin when he's finished presenting, but we'll also like to hear from you, particularly members of the media as well, who are joining in to this special media briefing. All right, well, Martin, I'm going to hand over to you, and we will speak again shortly.
Yeah, thank you, David, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. Now, I'm not going to be treading much of the same ground that Dr. Morne Malan did for us last week and Neil Emmerich did the week before about the benefits of economic freedom in general. I think it is simply worth saying at this juncture that there is a clear and unmistakable correlation between indicators of human development on the one hand and higher levels of economic freedom on the other. And economic freedom, of course, means a freer market economy whereby consumers and producers, rather than the state, decide how best to go about their own economic affairs. And most noteworthy, at least in my opinion, is that in countries with higher levels of economic freedom, or one can say the most capitalist states in the world, the poorest 10% of the population earn about 8 times more than the poorest 10% of the population in those countries with the least economic freedom, or one could say the most interventionist states. So this practically translates into the poorest of the poor earning about 250,000 Rand per year on average in the free market economies of the world, and the poorest of the poor earning only 30,000 Rand 500 per year on average in those countries where governments interfere more in the economy. But you don't have to take my word for it. You can ask the millions of people who flee and have fled Zimbabwe, which sits at the very bottom alongside Venezuela of the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World rankings. These people flee into South Africa rather than people from South Africa fleeing into Zimbabwe, just like the people flee out of Venezuela rather than people from neighboring states fleeing into Venezuela. And what can we take from this? And that is that the poor fundamentally understand that things are better for them, for the poor, in free market economies. And I think for a change, we should start listening to the poor rather than dictating to the poor. Now, the topic of my paper is specifically on the size of government and its relationship to economic freedom. And as David mentioned, this is a most auspicious week in this respect. Tomorrow, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana will deliver his medium-term budget policy statement, which is the first budget statement under the acclaimed Government of National Unity. So this is, in my view, one of the last, maybe one can say, easy moments for the GNU to announce a reform agenda. So it has already been over 100 days since the GNU was formed, and South Africans are now starting to form expectations around the policy environment. And thus far, we are certainly being led to believe that there will be no fundamental policy reform, instead only better implementation of existing but usually bad policy. So the Free Market Foundation hopes that Minister Godongwana will indicate that the government has resolved to move in a more fiscally prudent direction in tomorrow's statement. And we certainly hope that the February 2025 budget is further indicative of such a new posture. It would be most unfortunate, in our view, if Minister Godongwana statement tomorrow amounts to more of the same that has landed South Africa's economy in the gutter over these past few decades. Now, the FMF's tangible recommendations for Minister Godongwana and his cabinet colleagues, of course, are contained in our Liberty First Size of Government paper, which we believe, if implemented, will allow South Africa to climb the economic freedom rankings and thus produce better socio-economic outcomes. The bigger the government, the more resources it always feels compelled to extract from the productive sector of society. And inevitably, the bigger the government, the more it does, the more it intervenes. And as Neil Emmerich, Dr. Morne Malan, and the EFW Index have already established, in general, the more government does, the less society and commerce can do, and thus the lower the economic freedom in that society. So we at the FMF therefore believe in smaller, but more specifically, more limited government scope, size, and power. And we have divided our recommendations in this respect into 3 categories. The first being fiscal responsibility, which is concerned with how the government spends its money, or our money. Tax reform, which is concerned with how the government receives our money. And privatization, which addresses the division of labor between the private sector and the government. So I will very briefly run over our proposed policy reforms in each category, but I do encourage you to consult the full report for more details, or of course, you can ask some follow-up questions during the Q&A session. So as a matter of fiscal responsibility, we are quite aware and alive to the fact that the GNU was born in sin, one could say. President Ramaphosa radically enlarged his already large cabinet on the very nonsensical premise that it would be necessary to accommodate new coalition partners. So instead, the FMF has proposed in the past, and we will continue to propose, that South Africa's unwieldy cabinet be reduced from its current size of the president, deputy president, and 32 ministers and 43 deputy ministers to only 10 portfolios, which would comprise the presidency and 9 ministers and no more than 10 deputies. This is, of course, constitutionally compliant and covers all the necessary aspects of government action in South Africa. This will be a very important principle and certainly precedent to set that then must trickle down into the civil service. South Africa has about 1.3 million state employees, of which 55,000 earn more than 1 million rand per year. So according to research by Dr. Malan, some 18.6% of working South Africans are employed by the state. We spend 13.6% of our GDP on state salaries. Now compare this to Norway, where about 30%, which is much higher than South Africa, about 30% of their working population works for the government. But they only spend 11% of their GDP on state salaries. So the problem here, of course, is return on investment. Norway's civil service is proportionally larger than South Africa's. It is paid proportionally less than ours, but delivers a far greater value for their society than ours does for our society. So to say, as many do, unfortunately, that we must spend a lot of time and effort on upskilling and decorrupting our civil service is unfortunately a fantasy. We cannot, in good conscience, expect the taxpayer to continue forking out money for the insult that is South Africa's public administration. As such, the FMF has recommended that National Treasury immediately start taking tangible steps to reduce the state staff complement and, in particular, reduce the public sector wage bill. What we pay the state should be congruent with what we get out of the state in terms of service delivery. In this respect, we further encourage Parliament to adopt fiscal legislation that prohibits, by law, the National Treasury and provincial treasuries from proposing national or provincial budgets that are not balanced. It is absurd that we allow government to spend more than it is able to gather in revenue or to indebt future generations of taxpayers. Balanced budgets must be a matter of law in this country, certainly probably more than others. And we dare say that budget surpluses should also be something very seriously considered as a requirement for fiscal prudence. And our second category of policy change, which is tax reform, is very intimately related. So the more the government tries to do in the economy, and in our case usually fails, the worse the socioeconomic outcomes for ordinary South Africans. The perversity of this is manifested in how more and more South Africans are becoming dependent on social grants. And these grants are, of course, funded by taxpayers. And this number only keeps rising, in our estimation, because of government misconduct. The Social Security Agency says that about 45%, that's almost half of all South Africans, are somehow dependent on grants today. And that South Africa's tax to GDP ratio stands at 26%, one of the highest in the world, is therefore no surprise. So not only are taxpayers receiving very little return on investment for the taxes that they pay, but they are constantly required to pay more and more because government policy is destroying the economy. And taxpayers, of course, have no say in this. So the FMF has therefore recommended that this so-called new era of governance in South Africa must be accompanied by at least a modest income tax cut for all tax brackets, and that there should be a moratorium on any further tax increases for this parliamentary term. This will at least allow taxpayers to acclimatize to the current economic reality without being required year in and year out to accommodate more government in their personal and family budgets. What would also be something of a relief to taxpayers is to reduce the complexity of taxation in South Africa. And what we have identified as a simple, though not costless by any means, reform in this regard is to eliminate all the, for lack of a better word, non-standard taxes that South Africans are required to pay. So taxpayers are burdened by a bevy of things that they have to pay, including sin taxes, inheritance taxes, wealth taxes seem to be on the horizon, capital gains taxes. A carbon tax is potentially also something that the government seeks to implement in the medium term. We have plastic bag taxes, and the list really does go on endlessly. And our proposal is that in general, South Africans must legally only be required to pay four or fewer types of taxes, and that would be the personal income tax, the corporate income tax, the value added tax, and import export tax. The other taxes should all be progressively phased out over this term until only those remain. And this means that ultimately taxes should no longer be used as a tool for social engineering. Taxes, in principle, must exist to gather revenue for the government to provide basic services to the population. It should not be used as a means through which to change the behavior of ordinary consumers and businesses. So taxpayers cannot continue to be abused as they have been up to now. The exodus of skills and capital and investment from South Africa, at least in part, has been caused by the fundamental disrespect that taxpayers have been shown and continue to be shown, unfortunately, time and time again. And this is nowhere better manifested in every time that a politician has a brain-haired so-called good idea, they automatically, almost as a matter of course, expect the taxpayer to open their wallets and to fund it. So from smart cities to bullet trains to national health insurance, government never humbly tries to raise funds for itself or to cut spending to free up existing resources or to reduce its own mandate. It always either punishes the current taxpayer or it indebts the future taxpayer. So, in our view, government must begin to rely significantly more on the cutting of spending, the so-called, the very, very dreaded word of austerity, the raising of voluntary funds. That is something that we all have to do in voluntary society, and there is no reason the government should regard itself as, in principle, exempt from that requirement. And again, best of all, in our view, it must reduce its own scope and leave significant swaths of economic development where it ultimately belongs, to the private sector. So finally, but by no means least importantly, under tax reform, given the rise in the price of medication, the FMF is recommending that all doctor-prescribed medications be VAT exempt. It is a wonder to us that this was not done long ago already. Given that VAT is all about exemptions and reducing VAT exemptions, are all about reducing the price burden of important goods on the poor. So this should be a no-brainer. So, ladies and gentlemen, I turn very quickly to the final area of reform in our size of government report, being another dreaded word, the P word of privatization. And I think it is now clear to all South Africans, to all thinking South Africans at the very least, that the concentration risk represented by our state-owned enterprises has been disastrous to our economy, especially when we look at the two worst offenders being Eskom and Transnet. When both of them, as has been the case up until very recently, or one of them fails, we all fail. The whole society fails because they have been granted special state privileges that nobody in the private sector enjoys. We do not have a pressure release valve of multiple private coal and nuclear power providers in this country. We do not have the pressure release valve of multiple private railways that run alongside Transnet railways, or at least one or two privately owned ports. They are all owned by Transnet, and our power infrastructure to a very large degree, our significant power infrastructure to a very large degree, is owned by Eskom, meaning that if that institution, that singular institution fails, it drags the whole country down. So the FMF firstly recommends that any regulatory or legislative protections that state companies enjoy must immediately and unconditionally be revoked. All state companies and private companies must compete on the exact same terms. And that, of course, includes the post office, which apparently has a monopoly on light packages. That is utter nonsense. That has to be revoked so that the post office, which is subsidized by taxpayers, and courier companies, which are not subsidized by taxpayers, can compete on a fair playing field. So that is the most important kind of privatization that we believe in, the privatization of functions. But the privatization of assets is also crucial to provide even more relief to the taxpayer and ensure that scarce public resources are not wasted on bailing out companies with perverted incentive structures. So we therefore recommend that Eskom, Transnet, Denel, the Post Office, South African Airways, and PRASA be removed from the state's balance sheet and subjected to market discipline. Ladies and gentlemen, in summary, the Free Market Foundation's call on Minister Gorongwana and his colleagues is to use the occasion of the 2024 medium-term budget policy statement and the 2025 February budget to signal the Government of National Unity's commitment to fundamental policy change in the area of fiscal prudence. The government must commit, firstly, to fiscal responsibility and radically reduce the size of cabinet and the size and cost of the state workforce. This must be accompanied by a commitment to balancing South Africa's budget and even working towards a budget surplus. The government must live within its means. The GNU must, secondly, commit to providing relief to the taxpayer. There should, at the very least, be a modest income tax cut and a moratorium on tax increases during this parliamentary term. The Byzantine character of our tax system must also be replaced with a simple-to-understand approach that eliminates all ancillary social engineering taxes in favor of retaining at most the personal income tax, the corporate income tax, value-added tax, and import and export tax. Doctor-prescribed medication must also be exempt from VAT, and the government must commit itself to raising funds, at least in part, voluntarily and through spending cuts, rather than raising taxes or indebting future taxpayers. Thirdly, and finally, it is high time for the government to abandon the demonization of privatization and commit to opening competition in areas where state companies operate, rather than giving those state companies any special treatment. And of course, at long last, to remove inefficient and uneconomic enterprises from the state's balance sheet and to subject them to market discipline. Through these reforms, all South Africans, but again, especially the poor, will finally be able to reap the benefits of economic freedom. Thank you, and I will eagerly take your questions.
Thank you very much, Martin van Staden, for that excellent presentation. And I would like to now take an opportunity just to ask you a couple of follow-up questions. And I do see some questions coming through already in the chat from journalists and also from members of the public. So we'll definitely get to those in just a moment. But yeah, I think just to touch on one topic that you raised there, Martin, which is just around welfare dependency. And I did have a question here that came through to me directly. How could the government feasibly phase out social grants for individuals who are able to work, so that's not the disabled or the elderly, and reduce the tax burden on individuals and small businesses? And, I think many people make a moral argument around welfare that, for the indigent, people are not able to work for themselves. But I think in South Africa, we have many able-bodied people who could be participating actively as economic agents and generating growth and more opportunity and lowering that state dependency. What are some of your thoughts about phasing that out?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to notice here is that the poverty of the poor in South Africa is not their fault. I think that is always the important thing to note firstly. Because it's not by choice that able-bodied South Africans are sitting around twiddling their thumbs, waiting for handouts. People want the dignity that employment offers them. And that is why the FMF is not only putting forward a size of government paper and saying, hey, we just need austerity and then everything else falls into place. We believe in the liberalization of the economy as a holistic approach to solving poverty. And I just have to emphasize, this always works. It always works. Every country that has pursued the policies that free the economy, every country that is high up in the index of economic freedom, is a wealthier country. There is no country that ranks highly in economic freedom that is poor. That country does not exist, and it has never existed. So just to emphasize, freeing the market, liberalizing the economy, always works out well for the poor. So yes, phasing out welfare is something that would need to happen alongside, certainly at the very least, a liberalization of labor policy, which is something that Dr. Mornay Malan will discuss next week in that media briefing. But that would have to go along with the phasing out of any kind of grant system in South Africa, because we need the more or less 13 million unemployed South Africans to start working. They want to work. And the only reason that they're not finding employment is because the private sector is, to a very large degree, simply not allowed to employ them on terms that would be mutually beneficial. So we encourage the government of national unity, and frankly, any kind of branch or arm of state, or any combination of political parties that might in the future govern, to look at liberalization as a holistic and very clear solution to poverty, and that takes people off state dependency and makes them responsible agents that are ultimately responsible for their own prosperity. And then we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that poverty is some default state in South Africa, and that to propose that welfare be phased out is ridiculous, and that there will always be this mass of poor people. We have to be very careful about making that assumption, and many people make that assumption that poverty is some kind of normal phenomenon in this society and on this continent. It simply is not. When people are allowed to remove themselves from poverty, they do remove themselves from poverty. We just have to allow them, and currently we aren't.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a good point. And as you mentioned earlier in the presentation, many poor people around the world, not just here in sub-Saharan Africa, flee economically unfree countries in the pursuit of freedom and opportunity. You have people getting on a rubber dinghy and crossing the Mediterranean or the Gulf of Mexico, risking their lives for economic opportunity. So that's how much they value it. And so what we need to do is get the government out of the way and make it easier for people to actively participate in the job market. And yeah, 34% unemployment is really unconscionable. So Kwanda asks on YouTube, what is your opinion on opening a state bank? If it was properly run without corruption and was mostly private, would that alleviate poverty more quickly and directly? I have some thoughts on that, Martin, but if you want to have a crack, then I'd let you go for that.
Yeah, let me have a first word on this. No, I would say the if there is doing a lot of heavy lifting, Kwanda. And I mean, I've been to Europe a few times, and I see how a properly functioning state works well. I mean, they have large welfare states, they have a lot of regulations, and it works. I still don't think in principle it's a good idea, but if I had a magic wand and I could say government works properly in South Africa, then I might have a different job. I might be a practicing lawyer, and I wouldn't worry too much about limiting the size and scope of government, because things work in practice. We should not delude ourselves into thinking that we have the same social and historical factors working in our favor in South Africa that has any chance of producing what Europe has and what East Asia has. Europe and East Asia had to go through a lot of pain, and they're very kind of closely knit high trust societies for millennia before they started going through the pain of having a free market economy where the kind of the rugged grit, where people pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And only after that, huge wealth was built on the foundations of that high trust society and on the foundations of that explosion of industry that only a free market private property respecting society can produce. Only after that were they able to create these state institutions that do wealth transfers and that help people. You cannot, in our estimation, leapfrog from where South Africa currently is, which is a low, very, very low trust society, manifested, I think, above all in our war zone levels of a violent interpersonal crime between ordinary kind of South Africans. We are a very, very low trust society. And part of that is the very, very high levels of endemic corruption in this country that I think you can see across all branches of state and across, to a large degree, across all political parties. You cannot leapfrog over that and say that we are going to try and design this well-governed state bank, which will inevitably be granted special privileges that other banks do not have, which will inevitably have some kind of monopoly over certain types of transactions and so forth. I don't think you can skip over that. So I think the easy, very short answer is no. We need to not establish any more state-owned enterprises. And one of the recommendations that I didn't cover in the presentation, but which is in the paper, is that we should not establish any new state-owned enterprises unless we can privatize one to cover the cost of the new one first.
So one in, one out.
Yes, exactly. One in, one out, and ideally one out, one out, one out, and no new ones, because we've seen this movie before, and we keep seeing it. We keep establishing these new state committees, task forces, enterprises, and each of them fails very predictably, one after the other, because the incentive structure has not changed. And the incentive structure of the private sector, which admittedly, of course, there's also crime and corruption in the private sector, but the incentive structure there is built to diffuse the impact of that corruption, that private sector corruption, on the rest of society. I don't lose any money if Pick and Pay is corrupt. I don't lose any money if Spar is corrupt. But if we had a state monopoly in groceries, if it is corrupt, then it is a lot of skin off of my back and off of your backs, and certainly off of the backs of the poor. So we need to move away from this concentration risk and rather see to it that where the productive sector of society is, the private sector, that is where these decisions need to be made. That's not to say that it will be easy and that loans are going to flow freely from private sector banks, but there are far more basic, we would say, problems to solve in South Africa before we even get to the level of debt, access to debt for the poor and for entrepreneurs. We should get people working. That's really the first step, and we need to reduce the burden of the state on the taxpayer and certainly on industry. And then all of those other things will, as I said to the previous question, they will work themselves out, because they just have. In every attempt to bring about economic freedom in history, I would say it has worked if it is done sincerely. Of course, there's corrupt privatizations and so forth, and we would want to avoid that. But where there is an earnest attempt to bring about liberalization, and the country climbs the economic freedom of the world index, poverty just it solves itself ultimately.
Yeah, Martin. Just a brief point on this bank question. I think there'll be a lot of pressure for the state-owned bank to lend money at below market rates, at rates that commercial players wouldn't accept. And there's a reason why banks have the risk appetite that they do, because they're very sensitive to market conditions. And so ultimately what will happen with the state bank is someone will have to bear that cost. I mean, you see it with development finance institutions that lend for infrastructure projects, and they lend concessional loans or low interest loans, but taxpayers ultimately are footing that bill, which acts as a drag. We would say rather just leave more discretionary income in people's back pockets rather than trying to fund these kind of vanity projects. All right, so I just wanted to get to some comments from Stuart Pennington, who I think made a very interesting remark here. So that 34% is the official unemployment rate, but 12% is the real unemployment rate. And look, it's very hard to actually know how accurate that figure is. But what I would say is that reveals that there's a lot of labor market regulation non-compliance that's happening amongst poor South Africans in particular. If you go to any township in South Africa, I mean, you'll see a lot of thriving retail and other services, and people need goods and services, they will seek out those things. And so I would probably venture to say that there's a lot of people being paid below minimum wage, which suggests that the minimum wage is something, a pet project of policymakers trying to make some kind of moral statement. It's not actually really applicable to the labor market that we have here. I think we'll maybe park that discussion for next week when we deal with regulation, because I think that's very important. And then Stuart Pennington also asks, does the FMF ever get invited by government to present these thoughts? Look, sometimes the views that we have not necessarily shared by our friends in government, but we're definitely open to having these discussions, regardless of the political party that happens to occupy a certain ministry or a municipality or city or a province. So we're keen to engage, and we'll definitely send these reports to relevant ministers and departments as well. But part of what we rely on is people like yourselves disseminating these views and popularizing them, because we need some public pressure and support for these ideas. All right, let's go through some of the other comments. Kwanda actually had another question, which I'll direct at you there, Martin. How small of a government would South Africa need to be successful? What responsibilities would they keep, and which would they let go of, ideally?
Kwanda, you're asking extremely fun questions for me to answer, but these are big questions. We cannot say exactly what the specific size of the state should be, like X many employees and X many ministry, although we have recommended 10 portfolios for cabinet, and I think that's probably the basis upon which to speak from as far as South Africa's current constitutional context is concerned. Let me first say something about the ideal. So our value proposition is very much based in what is sometimes called classical liberalism, or just liberalism. And the idea there is very much that the state in society exists for a very specific, specialized, and particular purpose. It is not a general purpose vehicle. The state is not it's not like the head of the household who must respond to challenges to his family or to his household as they arise. That's a general kind of responsibility. The state has a limited and fixed responsibility, and that is to protect people's freedom and their property from coercion and from fraud, and that is it. And that ultimately comes down to the state having, or as I said, you cannot boil this down very specifically, but to having free responsibilities, and that's usually the police, the courts, and the military. And everything else, to a very large degree, if not to a absolute degree, is something that the private sector and the market is perfectly qualified to take care of. Even though it might not take care of it in a way that suits our ideals and our aspirations, it can do it, and it will do it ultimately in a way that makes more economic sense. Now, that is not the ideal that we live in South Africa. We do have a constitutional framework, and we do have a tradition of statist interference in the economy that very much agitates or militates against the classical liberal view, but still within this tradition, there is a way to reduce the scope and size of government and to do it in a constitutionally compliant way. And the way that we've recommended is that cabinet should be reduced to the presidency, which includes the president and the deputy president, the Home Affairs Ministry, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, the Social Development Ministry, the Justice Ministry. The others escape me for a moment. The Public Works Ministry, and yes, 2 or 3 more, which are all in the report. But these would eliminate things like forestry and fisheries. These would eliminate departments like agriculture. These would eliminate a very silly institution like the Department of Small Business Development. The only reason small business in South Africa is not developing is because we have an overzealous government. We don't need more government to help small business develop. We need less government, very specifically. So we have all these many many departments and agencies that are doing things that the taxpayer has to pay for dearly, that are very unrelated, not only certainly to the classical liberal social contract theory of the state, but even to our own constitution, which has a very generous conception of what the government should be doing. But our government is trying to do far more than that and dragging our economy down with it. So that's something that yes, I see David has put up our proposed cabinet there. And again, this is a constitutionally compliant cabinet. Every provision in the constitution is respected as far as welfare provision is concerned by this cabinet. And this would be given South Africa's level of development, given our levels of wealth, this would just make more fiscal sense. And it would certainly indicate from the government a higher degree of respect for the taxpayer.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems there, Martin, is that government itself is very highly centralized, very concentrated in the national functions. So I think it's also important to restructure government itself, decentralize it, and have smaller administrative functions devolve down to other administrative powers, but also not only within government, but to community groups, to business associations, people that are actually closer to the action, so to speak. Because some bureaucrat sitting in Pretoria is not able to understand all of the many complexities and diverse problems that exist in a country as vast as South Africa. All right. I would encourage more questions from people there in the chat. I see Skulk has a question around state bank being ridiculously bullish for the private sector and private monies like Bitcoin. I think if I interpret that correctly, he's saying, that would probably prompt many more people to seek out those alternative currencies. And we'll be exploring that in our Sound Money presentation. That'll be the 5th in the series of 5. So yeah, do tune in for that, Skulk. Thanks for the comment. And then, I would just say, Martin, I think we've almost become used to the fact that we have this very large overbearing government. It wasn't only the ANC government that was large and overbearing, it was also the apartheid government as well. And I think it's very important to also not default to this status quo bias. I think we've seen where this trajectory has led us. It's led us to inflated debts, massive deficits. The debt to GDP is about 75%, as I mentioned earlier. And that's really unsustainable. We're spending, a significant amount of our annual budget on just servicing debt. So we're living well beyond our means, and we're essentially eating into the wealth of future generations. So we're, in a way, stealing from our own children when we do this. And that is not just economically damaging; it's also socially very significantly onerous and corrosive to our society. So, these are very important problems and issues. Well, I think we are reaching the end of this live stream, but Martin, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say any last words before we conclude.
Yeah, sure. I guess I just had a thought that that came up earlier when you were talking about unemployment. I'm looking forward to next week's presentation and the paper we're also publishing in that regard. But you mentioned that there's a large degree of non-compliance with the labor laws, and I think this isn't said enough. And I really want to take every opportunity to say it, and that is that good that there's non-compliance, and increasingly more non-compliance with the laws and the regulations that really ultimately propose to keep people destitute and absolutely poor. So figuratively, of course, I take my hat off to everyone who ignores these destructive laws. You are heroes, you're unsung heroes. And I cannot legally encourage you to do more of it, but I will not judge you too harshly if you in fact do it, because your priorities are correct. You are taking care of yourself, you're taking care of your family, and you're trying your very best to uplift your community, while faraway politicians try their level best to make it all the more difficult for you to do that. So yeah, just my final thoughts is good on them, and here's to seeing a lot more of that.
And just a final comment there from Stuart. He asked us to familiarize ourselves with the work of Gigi Alcock, who's the author of that fabulous book, Cassionomics, which I am familiar with, and which shows just the pent-up entrepreneurial spirit that exists in South Africa. I think South Africans are hustlers, and we make it work. But we would do so much better if we had a smaller government, less interference, less burdensome regulation. So all we're talking about is just removing those barriers, and South Africa will surely flourish. But Martin, I just wanted to say thank you very much. Do remember, if you're watching this stream, go and check out the Liberty First website, libertyfirst.co.za, and also go and download Martin's excellent report. It's, like I said, very accessible, very forthright. And Martin mentioned the need for privatization. And the FMF has authored another paper on privatization, which delves into this in more detail. We'll be having a live stream later on in the week. That's for a separate project. But we'll be joined by one of our eminent associates, Dr. Christoph Klein. He's German-based, but he's got a lot of experience as an economist working in the South African market, and has some very interesting ideas for how to privatize some of these dysfunctional state-owned assets and network industries in particular. He's got a big focus on infrastructure. So do tune in for that. We'll be watching the budget policy statement on Wednesday. We are hoping for much more trimming of the fat from the finance minister. Our expectations are probably that it'll just be a holding pattern, but we can't continue on this trajectory for too much longer. We need some big trade-offs to be made and some significant cuts to government spending. All right, well, that's it from myself, David Ansara, and Martin van Staden, the FMF's head of policy. Until next time, stay free.